Hello, welcome back to our podcast. So my name is Sadie Garner. I'm Head of Teaching and Learning here at Itchen College.
And I'm James Bedwell, teacher of PE, but also teaching and learning coach at Itchen College.
So we're going to focus, I'm sure, around the country, everyone's looking at Rosenshines Principles in Action, written by Tom Sherrington in his, obviously, key book. We're going to focus today on strand 1. Particularly looking at small steps, sequencing and modelling. So, James, do you want to have any thoughts particularly?
So, looking at this idea of small steps to begin with, and if you've got the book there as well, which I know lots of colleges will have, we're sort of looking page 15 sort of onwards. Like this idea of small steps for new content, and when we think about students, maybe year 1 students on our courses where stepping from GCSE level to A level can be quite a big step in its own right, and the content level increases quite a lot. If we were just to go, right, here's our lesson objectives for today, here's what we want to do, and we just went sort of steamrolled straight through that, we'd probably leave the lesson with students going, haven't retained anything. So this idea of introducing small steps for new content, even complex content, I think is crucial. I know you had a couple of ideas and you went through in our latest CPD, like a few little ideas. Do you want to share?
Yeah, so when I talk about kind of sequencing into small chunks, so I teach sociology, and if I'm teaching a sociologist like Lemmett, I'll say, right, Lemmett, and on the board I'll write, looked at primary deviance. Right, Gemma, what do you reckon primary deviance is? Well, she can see in front of her it's the act, so primary deviance is the act. Reese, the other form of deviance is secondary. What was the first again for me? Just remind me. Primary deviance, Reese is the act, and Gemma, again, tell me, secondary deviance is the reaction. So even as I'm teaching new content, I will get them to do mini practices, and mini practices is them just verbalizing back to me exactly what I've just said. So it's new content with practice, but that literally takes the form of questioning as I deliver. And then once we've put that all on the board and all on their packs, then we will go, so we use coloured grids, then we will go to the grid that has Lemmett there, and then I will get them as a group, each take student in turn to verbalise. Right, Sarah, could you tell me, Lemmett talked about, she'll say primary and secondary deviance, and then I'll get each student in, say, for example, a row of 4 to carry on, to finish off each person's sentence. So it's that new content and it's practice after each stage of that content. And what I find is that just helps exactly what Rosenshines says, which is the limitations of working memory. So they're not overwhelmed, they're not over-processing information, it's small and it's chunked and it's much slower. So there's lots and lots of recap in a verbal form. Once I've done that sociologist in another one in the same form, then we would do a Nearpod, then we would do a crossword, then we would do a brain dump. So it's checking all of the learning as well.
Again, that sort of links into moving back to his book, Strand 4, where we're looking at reviewing the different types of practice, so you can see that all these strands and ideas sort of link together. And I like the fact that it's, as you go through, it's like a verbal check, and lots of questioning to help with, checking the new information. And I think it's quite in some ways an easy way to get some retrieval questions in there as well, and to link to other content. And again, Rosenshine makes reference to, if we're linking to previous knowledge and content, which is hopefully in their long-term memory, then that makes it easier for them to use the new content or to understand its place within the content as well. But no, I really like those ideas.
And also the whole point that kind of the least effective teachers ask, he specifically says, I think on page 64, the least effective teachers ask 9 questions in 40 minutes of content. And the same is true that, again, with that really short new steps, new material, so chunk practice is again really effective teachers, because obviously Rosenshine is using master teachers with cognitive science, and what he finds is that in 40 minutes is how long really effective teachers take to go through content, whereas again least effective 23 minutes, half the time, kind of practice explaining, questioning, clarifying, so that they're really, really clear of that knowledge as they move on and move through. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I think one of the key things, sort of building on this strand one, links to how we might model to help with this new content and how it needs to be applied in a certain way to answer a 2-mark question, a 6-mark question, a 20-mark or essay question, wherever it might be, or to help us use it in a vocational sense in terms of like attacking a distinction standard piece of work. I've sort of made a couple of notes talking about the modelling aspects of this, and I think it's really crucial for students to understand the actual process, the doing process of how do we get to this outcome. I know it makes reference to this idea of live modelling, which is this idea of the teacher running through, right, sentence 1, here's how we're going to start. I'm going to start with, this word. That's where we might be then asking students to add maybe little bits of content, but we're sort of running through it as a group as to how we're going to produce this 6-mark response. And in there, it's this idea of the teacher thinking out loud. It makes reference to, rather than just creating a response and saying, what have I done here? It's right, now I'm going to add this connective, right, however. Why have I just introduced this idea of however? Right, because we're evaluating, that's what we need to do to get to the top band or whatever it is for a 20-mark, or that's what we've been asked to do for the BTEC distinction piece of work. And there's lots of different ways, about live modelling. I'm quite keen on using the visualizer. Again, a little bit of a budget cost, but it can be quite easily done on a whiteboard in front of everyone. I know Glenn likes to type his responses as he goes through because he finds it slightly quicker and easier for us to go through, and he's thinking out loud, but he's typing the responses as you go through. So lots of different ways to help us get that new content, new information into a 6-mark, a 10-mark, a 20-mark, or whatever it might be. I know in some cases yours are big responses,
yeah, 40s, big old questions. So yeah, I think that's that whole really key, I think, to separate the difference between a scaffold and modelling. So I see a scaffold as a literal structure to help them, and I think I found that our scaffolds have come from the mark schemes. So if I think of our methods paper, in a 20-marker, they have to write perverts down their page or whiteboard, and they have to plan with that pervert structure. Practical issues, ethical issues, reliability, validity, and each one of those is a paragraph, and that's a scaffold to help them plan. And it comes from the mark scheme, because in the mark scheme, the examiners literally wrote, or the chief examiner wrote, we want to see practical issues, ethical issues, reliability, validity. It's formed from them. The same is true if you look at our classroom. We've got Rise on the wall, Grover. We've got these scaffolds. We also use scaffolding in structured grids. So we use colour coordinated grids, and we structure the theory into paragraphs or themes for them. And that scaffold obviously can be taken away as they get more confident, or they can come back to it. Whereas a model is, like you said, James, is verbally narrating, literally sentence by sentence, the exam question or the structure. Or it's, if in maths or physics, it's literally verbally narrating your cognitive process as a teacher, so that the learner can see exactly what they're supposed to do. So the scaffold is those structures, whereas the modelling is step by step. And you're right, I generally find giving them the 5-marker later on in the year might be helpful for them to criticise, but they must see modelling. And I think I know you do a similar thing in your subject, which is, I know as teachers we're so time strict, but we make YouTube videos of us modelling, like Glenn does, typing it out with the exam question. So every single week For crime, they're seeing a modelled answer with the content they just taught in the lesson, and the same is true for crime. I would strongly recommend them because they really help your workload. Once they're made, they're done. And you know, with content delivery, it's really important that that modelling doesn't go, you know, we don't lose that modelling at the expense of getting through content, because, you know, it's really, really, really key, really key.
Definitely. And I think going back to when we were in lockdown, we probably did a lot more modelling because we weren't face to face. And I know I've got lots of screencastifys, which are, you know, nice sort of 4 or 5 minute clips, in some cases slightly longer for longer style questions, which now can be reused. Even though I'm in the classroom and I could be doing it live, I've already got a good example, so I'm saving myself, you know, 10 minutes of going through and preparing how I'm going to model this one, because I've already got the video clip. And I think it's quite important because some of us might have forgotten about those, and they could be quite time saving in terms of going back and actually using that. And at the same time, they could also be uploaded. Some teachers might want to use that as a homework task and make sure, right, I want you to do this 10 marker, but here's my model of me doing a slightly different question, potentially. So that, you know, if it's a recorded clip, use it in your lessons, can use it for homework, can use it just as a guide on your Google Classroom to upload, and the students have always got that live model. They can pause it, which is really nice, because in the lesson they can't do that, but they can pause it, rewind it, actually, how did we get to this step? And then they can gradually see the end product.
I think that's really nice, because that was also my kind of educational COVID keep. It was Nearpod, and it was creating the YouTube videos that I created over the lockdown, and just thought to myself, this is definitely a really effective way. And if I look at, this must be a similar thing with you, if you look at Student Voice, they really, really, really like them. Obviously you still do live modelling in lessons, but it just means every week they're getting that cognitive support. And he says, doesn't he, I think on page 76, that novice learners need to observe the explicit thinking that's usually hidden. You have to be explicitly clear about when you've seen this 5 marker, what is your approach, what are you thinking, what are you doing when you see rapport, you think relationship, you think validity. They've got to see that explicit learning. And particularly in most of our subjects, even if they've studied it at school, they will still be novice to that new area of the curriculum, and need that support.
And that's why, again, as novice learners, like we said, it could be first years, could be second years, attempting those larger questions, having the structures or the scaffolds. And again, on page 23, Rosenshines included a few examples, which we're probably all familiar with. P, point, evidence, explain. So you squid and petal in there, which you might be familiar with. But having that structure helps with students using new information and putting it into the correct structure to, you know, obtain all 5 marks, but then seeing that live process of how we get mark 1, how do we get mark 2, how do we get to, you know, 3.4.5, rather than just going, here's one that has got 5 marks, because again, novices or new learners, limited working memory, won't be able to break that down and necessarily see explicitly how have we obtained all of those marks, how have we structured it. And I find within A-level PE, when we look at 10, 20 markers, sometimes students find it difficult to actually get right in the first sentence. But what we're finding now is with some of my second years, they can, you know, generally they've got the content, they know generally how they're going to apply it, you know, using structures or scaffolds, but it's now just reducing that to maybe a sentence starter. And again, on page 22, there's this idea of writing frames. And these come from sort of an English background, but throughout the novel, the author ... So a nice way to maybe get the students to then, you know, be able to add their information, their content. Right, now I've picked up the first 2 marks. How am I going to start the second sentence using a writing frame? And
the scaffold basically being, sometimes the scaffold is a verbal starter. They always start this type of exam question with one reason. That's the first thing. That even verbal scaffolding really helped. And I think it's really interesting because I've read other things that say that basically this whole idea of modelling too much takes away them from being independent learners. But what I think I have to fundamentally agree that independent learners, for me, is when they get into the exam hall, when they're all alone, on their own, that is true independence. And everything between now and that point is structuring, letting go a little bit more, but no coming back in when they're wobbling, letting go a little bit more.
Yeah,
and
changing the complexity.
Yeah, making it harder. Let's look at, I know you've seen a model of this really considered to be straightforward 5. Now let's see an evil one.
Yeah.
Let's keep moving between them, and just making sure that at every point links to the exam criteria or the assignment are really made clear, so they've got that support in place. Same is true when they're writing an assignment in BTEC. Really, the independent is when they're writing, but everything up into that point and the feedback after is getting to that independent stage.
I think maybe just a final point to make, which we discussed beforehand, was this idea of you getting students, when they are doing an independent, whether it's a homework task or a mock paper, and they're attacking an essay-based questions, to write that scaffold down the side of the paper, and then for them to go back and to tick off and to go, yes, I've done this, because ultimately we're not going to be there in the exam for them to do that. But like you say, everything up until that point is that idea of guided practice and us helping them, taking them step by step, small information, giving them the scaffold and the structure, but also showing them how to get to that point where they can get top marks in an exam-based question, or to get the distinction-based criteria for a BTEC-based course.
Don't underestimate an examiner's report, a mark scheme for getting those scaffolds in as well. I'd really recommend that. Right, thank you so much, folks. Thanks for listening. Any questions, just let us know on Twitter or email us if you work in our organisation. Thank you very much.